Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take a whole stack of sources, really dig in and pull out the key insights. Our goal, to help you get up to speed on complex topics fast.
And today, we're looking at something that feels, well, incredibly relevant everywhere right now. It's about how leaders use language, how that connects to power.
Exactly. And specifically, we're exploring how populist rhetoric can intersect with actions that might be seen as authoritarian.
It's a dynamic you really do see playing out globally, isn't it? Challenging, the usual ways of doing politics and public discussion.
For sure. And for this deep dive, we've got a really focused analysis to work with. It looks at a fascinating and honestly pretty challenging case study, El Salvador under President Nayib Bukele.
That's right. Our mission today really is to explore the study that dissects President Bukele's communication, especially his discourse, his language around the very intense war on gangs.
Okay, so the core question, based on this analysis we're looking at, is in what ways does populist rhetoric show up in his language? And how might that narrative, according to this specific study, work to legitimize some pretty rigorous, potentially authoritarian policies?
Yeah, and it's so important to set the scene here. El Salvador. I mean, it's been grappling with a really profound, deeply rooted gang crisis for decades. This isn't something new.
No, not at all.
It's like this persistent scar on the country, impacting daily life, creating immense fear, for generations of Salvadorans.
Yeah.
Tragically, at one point, it gave the country this reputation, one of the most dangerous places on earth.
Horrifying statistics. And President Bukele's arrival, his presidency, it really marked a significant shift, didn't it? A real turning point in how the state tackled this massive, devastating problem.
Definitely. So just to be clear for everyone listening, our job here isn't really to debate the policies themselves or, the political rights and wrongs.
Right.
Our role as guides through this material is more to illuminate the analytical perspective that's presented in the sources we have. We're looking at the language patterns identified, the communication strategies.
The theoretical frameworks the analysis uses, the examples it pulls out.
Exactly. We're dissecting the how and the why of the communication as this particular study sees it. It's really about understanding the rhetoric.
Okay, perfect. So let's start unpacking this with the context. It's crucial. El Salvador, its history with gangs, and Bukele's rise to power.
Absolutely. To really get the impact of the rhetoric, you have to understand the ground it fell on. El Salvador's struggle with gangs like MS-13, Mara Salvatrucha, and Barrio 18, it's long, it's brutal.
And these weren't like homegrown issues initially. The analysis points to a more complex origin story.
That's a really critical point. Their origins are deeply tied up with the Salvadoran Civil War back in the late 20th century, and then the migration that followed, especially to the U.S.
So the gangs didn't just spring up in El Salvador. They were, in a way, exported back.
Precisely. In the 90s, you had stricter U.S. immigration policies, leading to large-scale deportations. Many of those deported had joined gangs in places like L.A.
Right.
They were sent back to a post-war El Salvador that just didn't have the infrastructure, the jobs, the state control in many areas.
So tragically, it was fertile ground.
Incredibly fertile ground for these highly organized criminal groups to set up shop, expand rapidly, and just embed themselves in communities right across the country.
And the impact?
Yeah.
Devastating. The analysis mentions that homicide rate in 2015 peaking at, 103 per 100,000 people?
Astronomical. To give you some perspective, that's just vastly higher than most countries that aren't in, open warfare.
It paints this picture of daily life just dominated by fear, constant threat of violence, extortion, these groups controlling neighborhoods.
Exactly. And past governments, they tried different things. Some went for the mano dura, the tough hand, mass arrests approach. Others tried negotiating truces. But as the analysis points out, none of them really solved the problem in the long run. And many approaches faced criticism, right? Either for harming democratic values, human rights, or just not working.
So this history of fear, and maybe a perception that the state couldn't protect people, created this deep public desire for security.
A profound yearning, yeah. Which brings us straight to Nayib Bukele. His rise really felt different.
It did. He came into office in 2019, pretty young, 37, the youngest president in El Salvador's democratic history. And it wasn't just a win, it was a landslide. 53% in the first round.
Yeah, that fundamentally shook up the whole political system. It ended, 30 years of power basically switching between the two main parties, FMLN and Arena?
So the analysis suggests this showed a real public hunger for something new, a break from the old ways.
Definitely seems that way. And his own political path wasn't exactly linear. He started out with the left-wing FMLN party.
Right, before kind of charting his own course.
Yeah. He was mayor of Nuevo Cuscatlán, then the capital, San Salvador, which was a big platform. But things soured with FMLN. He was expelled in 2017. Reports mention ideological clashes, maybe resistance to his unconventional style and growing popularity.
And that led him to create his own political movement.
Moya's ideas or new ideas, the analysis describes its initial vision as, inclusive, democratic.
And it highlights their use of social media, which was pretty innovative at the time.
Hugely effective. They used digital platforms to mobilize support directly, kind of going around the traditional party structures. There's this detail about needing 50,000 signatures to register the party.
Standard procedure, right?
Yeah, but the source emphasizes Nueva's ideas got them in just 3 days. Which wasn't just fast, it was this powerful demonstration of their ability to connect and mobilize people incredibly quickly online. Kind of a preview of his later communication style.
But even with that momentum, actually getting the party registered for the 2019 election hit some snags.
Right, issues with the electoral tribunal as the material details. So Nueva's ideas couldn't technically run under its own name for the presidency that year.
So how did he overcome that?
Strategy. He aligned with the Granada Party, which was more of a center-right conservative group, but his campaign message stayed consistent. Transparency, anti-corruption, and crucially, a huge focus on fixing security and the economy, which he tied closely together.
And right at the heart of that security promise was the war on gangs.
Absolutely. Became his defining slogan. And once in office, it was priority number 1, translated into policy pretty quickly. He launched the Guerra contra las Pandillas.
The war on gangs.
Yeah. And the main vehicle was the Territorial Control Plan. The analysis breaks it down. It's this multi-stage security strategy. 6 phases made public anyway: preparation, opportunity, modernization, incursion, extraction, integration, plus a 7th phase kept under wraps.
Implementing something like that obviously needs money, big money. And initially, the National Assembly, controlled by the opposition, wasn't playing ball.
Which led to one of the most dramatic moments highlighted in the analysis. The Assembly was delaying the funding for the security plan. President Bukele, as the source describes it, took this extraordinary step. He marched into the legislative chamber, accompanied by armed soldiers.
Wow, with soldiers?
Yeah, a direct, forceful act. An unmistakable show of power, really, designed to pressure the lawmakers.
And that must have caused a huge backlash.
Oh, definitely, including from the Supreme Court, criticizing the use of military force against the legislature. But he eventually got the funding approved.
He did.
And after that, his administration significantly ramped up the budget for the Ministry of Defense and, as the analysis points out, really encouraged the use of lethal force against gang members.
And the scale of the crackdown that followed was just immense.
Huge. The source details record numbers of arrests, people in prison. It led to El Salvador having the highest incarceration rate in the world, over 1,000 prisoners per 100,000 people.
And the government wasn't shy about showing this off. The analysis mentions deliberately publicizing images, especially online, of prisons just packed, hundreds of inmates crammed together.
Yes, those visuals became a key part of the public narrative, projecting strength, effectiveness against the gangs. And what the analysis finds really compelling is this. Despite adopting measures widely seen as more authoritarian, like the ongoing state of exception suspending certain rights,
Right.
Bukele has managed to keep what the source calls unwavering loyalty and support from a large chunk of the population. His approval ratings have stayed remarkably high through all this.
And that popularity seems totally intertwined with his unique, often controversial online presence.
Absolutely. His strategic, heavy use of social media X, Facebook, YouTube, it's defining. It lets him bypass traditional media, which he often frames as hostile or biased.
Right, cutting out the middleman.
Exactly. Lets him talk directly to the public, craft his own message, control his image.
That time he called himself the world's coolest dictator on X. That's a prime example, right?
It really is. And the analysis doesn't just see it as a throwaway comment. It interprets it as, like, a calculated move. Part irony, part marketing strategy.
How so?
Well, it acknowledges the international criticism, the authoritarian label, but it also mocks it, maybe disarms critics, or even turns it into this weird badge of honor for supporters who like his perceived strength and defiance.
And his online feed isn't just serious policy stuff.
No, that's part of the persona management. It's this mix. Humorous posts, sometimes almost carefree-sounding updates about government stuff, alongside very serious, often quite stern statements about his policies, especially the gang crackdown.
It's like an oscillation between charismatic guy and strongman.
Precisely. A deliberate balancing act. But the analysis also notes he cultivates a different side, too.
Like changing his ex-bio to just Layla's dad.
Exactly. Highlighting this effort to balance the assertive, sometimes autocratic political style with something relatable, human, connecting on a personal level. And the analysis really suggests the skilled use of digital platforms, this carefully built persona, has been absolutely key to keeping his popularity so high, even as his policies got tougher.
Okay, so that sets the stage incredibly well. Now let's dive into the theoretical tools the analysis uses to make sense of all this.
Yeah.
We need to talk about populism and authoritarianism.
Right, these are the main concepts the study uses to unpack Bukele's discourse. And populism, as the analysis notes, is, well, it's complicated, widely debated, often used kind of loosely to describe this global trend that seems to be challenging democratic norms.
So how does this particular analysis define it?
It takes the view of populism as a thin-centered ideology, which basically means its core idea is pretty simple, focused on one fundamental division in society. It's not like, say, socialism or liberalism with detailed answers for everything.
So if it's thin, what's the actual core?
The analysis explains the absolute core is splitting society into two groups, seen as homogeneous and antagonistic. The pure people versus the corrupt elite.
Ah, the classic us versus them. Can't miss it.
Exactly. And central to this is the idea that populism is about protecting the will of the people, sometimes even prioritizing this perceived collective will over established rules, like human rights or constitutional checks.
The analysis also calls it a moralistic imagination of politics. What does that mean?
It means framing political issues primarily in terms of good versus evil. The people are inherently good, the elite inherently corrupt and bad. It's very black and white.
And it's also described as a political style.
Yeah. The source mentions repertoires of embodied, symbolically mediated performance, which is a bit academic, but basically means how a populist leader communicates their performance, their presentation, the symbols they use, is just as crucial as what they say in connecting with their base.
Okay. But whether it's an ideology, a moral view, or a style, the common thread is.
The analysis stresses it's that Manichaean rhetoric of us versus them, that good versus evil divide.
Manichaean, yeah, stark division.
And crucial to this populist stance, according to the analysis, is not just criticizing elites, but claiming to be the only authentic voice representing the people. A monopolistic claim.
Which inherently challenges the idea of pluralism, right? That different groups and views are legitimate.
Exactly. It challenges pluralism and often the existing democratic structures that allow for that diversity of voices.
Okay. And the analysis identifies specific rhetorical markers of populism it looks for in Bukele's language.
Yes, it focuses on 4 key attributes: anti-establishmentarianism, vox populi, which is Latin for the voice of the people.
Got it.
The use of crisis and threat narratives, and nationalism. We'll see how the analysis argues these pop up in his gang war discourse.
Well, before we get to the examples, let's quickly define the other key concept: authoritarianism.
Right. From the political science angle used here, authoritarianism is defined by prioritizing collective security for the group at the expense of liberal autonomy for the individual. Basically, order and group safety trump individual freedom.
And what are the typical features of authoritarian regimes, according to these sources?
The analysis lists a few. Limited political pluralism.
Sure.
So, opposition might exist on paper, but it's weak, harassed, controlled.
Okay.
They often lack a deep ideology, relying more on things like nationalism or promising stability to justify their rule. Political mobilization tends to be low after they consolidate power, though they might use it initially to get there. And finally, they often co-opt key sectors: the military, courts, big business, bringing them into the regime's orbit to maintain control.
The analysis also brings up competitive authoritarianism. What's that?
It's a kind of hybrid regime. It keeps the appearance of democracy. They hold elections, opposition parties exist, but the whole system is tilted to favor the incumbents. Things like manipulating media coverage, using state resources for campaigning, harassing opponents, maybe even fiddling with voter rolls or suppressing civil society groups. It looks democratic on the surface, but the competition isn't really fair.
Okay, so how do these two things, populism and authoritarianism, interact? How can that mix challenge democracy?
Well, the analysis is careful to say populism isn't inherently anti-democratic. It could even be a corrective, right?
Yeah.
Bringing attention to ignored issues, engaging people left out.
Yeah.
But the sources argue when populism merges with authoritarian tendencies, that's where the significant risk to democratic processes lies. That mix can fuel extreme polarization, a push to centralize power in the leader, and a really strong anti-pluralist attitude rejecting the legitimacy of any opposition.
It sounds like they can kind of reinforce each other.
They really can. The analysis suggests the core danger is when the populist rejection of elites gets linked up with authoritarian values, like demanding security above all else, conformity, loyalty. Authoritarian populists, this view argues, claim legitimate power isn't with established institutions, which they call corrupt, but with the authentic voice of the people.
And they use that claim to justify their actions.
Precisely. The analysis argues they might justify undermining democratic norms or rights by saying, hey, this is what the real people want, creating this veneer of legitimacy for potentially undemocratic moves. It's a powerful rhetorical move, tapping into frustration with politics as usual and leveraging that desire for strong, decisive action, especially when people feel they're in a crisis.
Okay, that framework is clear. Let's now apply it, just like the analysis does, to President Bukele's rhetoric, starting with that first attribute. Anti-establishmentarianism, framed as identifying enemies of the nation.
Yeah, this is classic populist strategy. The analysis shows in detail how Bukele's language works to systematically undermine and delegitimize various groups. He positions them as outsiders, working against the pure people and the nation's interests. They become the them in that us versus them structure.
Who exactly does the analysis pinpoint as these others, these enemies?
It points to several key groups: public media outlets, political rivals, the international community, and NGOs, non-governmental organizations. And the language isn't just critical, it's often really harsh, accusatory, designed to demonize.
The analysis gives examples of this strong language.
It does. Like when talking about former officials, the term used is incredibly loaded. Traitors, traitors. The analysis points out this isn't just political disagreement. It's assigning moral failure. They're not just opponents, they're betrayers of the nation. It draws this sharp moral line. Us, the loyal people led by Bukele, versus them, the corrupt, treasonous elite.
So blaming past politicians is a recurring theme.
Oh, absolutely. The analysis emphasizes how Bukele consistently paints past politicians as responsible for the country's suffering. He alleges they were basically in bed with the gangs, that their corruption and collusion caused the violence and death. It wasn't just bad governance, it was active betrayal.
And he also targets NGOs and the international community pretty hard.
Yeah, they're another major enemy group. The analysis details how he frequently accuses them of political bias, of spreading lies about El Salvador, of meddling in his government's business. There's often this conspiratorial tone suggesting they aren't really trying to help, but are actually hindering progress, maybe protecting criminals under the cover of human rights, or even profiting from the country's problems.
The analysis mentions him dismissing international efforts, calling past peace deals a farce.
Exactly. Framing things like that discredits alternative solutions and positions his way as the only legitimate one. And the source gives that really striking quote about these groups. And of course, they're friends from the international community, and they're friends from the so-called human rights NGOs. They are against human rights. The analysis reads this as building a narrative of conspiracy painting this picture, where gangs, international bodies, and human rights groups are somehow all working together against his security efforts.
He even uses sarcasm, humor almost, to push back against criticism from these groups.
That's where the strategic persona really comes into play. The source gives that provocative example where he seems to offer gang members to international critics. If they care about them so much, they can have them all, 2 for the price of 1.
Wow.
Yeah. The analysis explains how a comment like that cleverly shifts the focus. It turns the tables, painting the international groups as naive or hypocritical. You care about these guys, fine, you take them. It sidesteps the substance of the criticism about his government's actions and reframes the whole issue.
So this rhetoric basically acts like a shield.
Yeah, the analysis suggests it deflects criticism effectively. By framing critics, whether foreign or local, as out-of-touch outsiders or part of some plot, he reinforces that us versus them divide. The quote, some say, some of those people who don't live in our country, they say that Salvadorans are oppressed, just dismisses external concerns as ignorant or malicious.
And that anecdote about the woman, the supporter whose son was arrested, How does that fit in?
The analysis uses that example to show how he can even use negative impacts of his policies to reinforce his narrative. He highlights her continued overall support despite her personal hardship. It becomes proof, in his framing, that the wider population understands and accepts the tough measures. It bolsters his authority, his right to make difficult choices for the supposed greater good. The key takeaway here, according to the analysis, is how this aggressive anti-establishment talk isolates enemies, disqualifies their views, and frames opposition not just as disagreement, but as a threat to the nation itself.
Okay, let's move to the second populist attribute identified. Vox populi, the voice of the people, which the analysis discusses under a unified people.
Right. This is all about building and reinforcing the idea of the people as this single, united, pure entity. Bukele's rhetoric, as the analysis shows, constantly uses collective words like we and our. It fosters this sense of shared identity, shared experience, always contrasted with the they, the enemies.
And the analysis notes he uses quite affectionate language when talking about citizens.
Yeah, terms like noble and united people, or the very personal, my beloved Salvadoran people. That use of my, the analysis points out, tries to create this almost familial, paternalistic bond. Leader and people. It fits that populist playbook, positioning the leader as one of the people, speaking directly to the common man, unlike the out-of-touch elite. It builds this image of warmth, closeness, alongside the strength.
So he initially frames the fight against gangs as something everyone achieved together.
Initially, yes. The rhetoric presents it as this joint effort, a titanic effort by thousands of Salvadorans. There are quotes like, Salvadorans have set an example for the world, that anything can be resolved if there's will to do it. That explicitly includes the people as active players in the success. It kind of empowers citizens, makes them feel part of the solution.
But the analysis points out a shift, a subtle but important one, in how this is framed later on.
Yes, and this is where the connection to potentially more authoritarian dynamics starts to emerge, according to the analysis. While initially it's about collective action, the language gradually shifts. It starts portraying the people more as passive recipients of improvements delivered by the government.
Oh, so?
The source gives examples like, it is now normal for Salvadorans to walk at 9:00 at night, or to cross streets that were forbidden, or to play in the park. Now, these describe real, tangible improvements in daily life thanks to better security. Huge improvements.
But the way it's phrased emphasizes what the government did for the people, not what they achieved together.
Exactly. The analysis argues that presenting the government, and by extension, Bukele himself as the direct provider of these hard-won benefits, like the freedom to walk safely, reinforces his image as this essential protector. It can subtly create a sense of public dependence on his leadership for their safety and well-being.
And how does that potentially legitimize more authoritarian measures?
The analysis suggests that by subtly downplaying the role of citizens as active agents in change, moving them from participants to grateful beneficiaries, it shrinks the space for critical debate or opposition. If safety is presented as a gift from the leader, questioning his methods becomes harder, less likely for his supporters. It allows him to act with less scrutiny, justifying decisions by saying they're simply in the public interest, fulfilling the vox populi without needing broad debate on the methods. It smooths the path for a more top-down approach.
Which ultimately helps consolidate his power.
That's the argument. By positioning his government as the sole source of peace, security, and the good things that follow, Bukele cements his status as the indispensable agent of change. This narrative boosts his authority by linking his leadership directly to improvements in people's lives, justifying his policies through the visible results and the public acceptance that follows. The takeaway here is how the analysis shows this idea of a unified people isn't just about solidarity, it can also pave the way for centralized power by reframing citizens as recipients of state-provided security.
The third attribute, crisis and threat narratives, really comes through in the section the analysis calls healing from terror.
This strategy is incredibly powerful, especially in a society that's lived through decades of intense violence. The analysis focuses heavily on President Bukele's central metaphor, comparing gang violence to a devastating disease, specifically cancer. He calls it a sickness.
Right, like a cancerous growth with tentacles spread throughout the state.
Exactly. It portrays the issue not just as a problem, but as this pervasive, life-threatening disease infecting the entire nation.
And he uses that really stark quote, "Healing our country from the gangs is like healing a body with cancer. But it is either that, or we die of cancer."
This metaphor, the analysis explains, is incredibly effective at creating urgency and justifying extreme measures. You don't negotiate with cancer. You fight it aggressively. By framing gangs as an existential threat like terminal cancer, it powerfully supports that populist tactic of presenting the situation as a massive crisis, needing decisive, even radical action.
And cancer is something everyone understands, everyone fears.
That's key to its power. It makes the metaphor instantly relatable, emotionally charged. It taps into those deep fears about health, death, existence itself. The analysis notes this elevates the whole discussion to a moral level. Fighting the cancer becomes the morally right thing to do. And implicitly, anyone opposing the methods could be painted as somehow favoring the disease or blocking necessary treatment. It marginalizes opponents by framing them as threats to the nation's health.
And the nature of aggressive cancer treatment, chemo, surgery, it justifies harsh policies.
It really does. Those treatments are often brutal, painful, with terrible side effects, but people accept them, demand them even, if they're seen as necessary to save a life. The analysis shows Bukele using this. If my body had to take a hit, I would take it. I'll get rid of that cancer, and then I can recover and have a better life. It frames his tough, potentially rights-infringing methods as unpleasant but absolutely essential and necessary hit the nation has to endure to survive and get better.
The urgency of starting treatment immediately also seems important in that metaphor.
It underlines the need for swift, decisive action. That quote, "But if we don't do it now, then when? If we don't rid our country of this cancer now, then when will we ever do it?" really hammers that home. The analysis suggests framing interventions as urgent medical necessities provides moral justification for actions that might otherwise seem too authoritarian. It also reinforces the idea that only this aggressive approach can work, potentially making the public dependent on these tough measures as the only way forward.
So this rhetoric really taps into and amplifies public fear.
That's a core finding of the analysis here. By presenting gangs as this existential cancer, it connects directly with people's deepest fears and insecurities. And this aligns perfectly with authoritarian tendencies, which often gain traction by offering a strong, unifying response to perceived threats, be it disorder, decay, or enemies. It provides a powerful justification for strong state control, all under the banner of national security and survival. The key takeaway is how the analysis reveals this cancer metaphor as a tool harnessing fear and moral urgency to justify extraordinary actions by framing them as unavoidable, life-saving treatment.
Okay, the fourth area the analysis looks at is reclamation of power, linking it to nationalism, vox populi, and anti-establishment ideas.
Yeah, this theme revolves around a narrative of national rebirth, rescuing the country, restoring its power, its dignity. Bukele's language, as analyzed, consistently portrays El Salvador as having undergone this profound turnaround under his leadership. Statements like, "After 4 years, El Salvador is a different country. We are no longer afraid. We stopped our free fall and began to fly."
That's powerful imagery.
It really is. It paints this picture of a nation saved from collapse, now soaring, positioning his government as the unique force behind this miracle.
So, while it's framed as a national success, he's clearly positioning himself as the central figure.
Oh, absolutely. The indispensable architect of this change. The analysis points out he constantly backs this up by citing specific security gains, lower murder rates, less extortion, tangible proof to validate his claims and his methods.
And this success story is often set against the backdrop of past failures.
Yes, that's a key tactic identified. Comparing his government's results to the perceived failures of previous administrations. Calling them ineffective, weak, maybe even complicit with the gangs, it reinforces that anti-elite stance they were part of the problem he had to fix.
The analysis also mentions his style, his demeanor describing it as one of definitive certainty.
That confidence is part of the populist performance. Phrases like, "Of course we did it," project this image of absolute success, total competence. The analysis suggests this certainty feeds into an authoritarian image. Someone who knows best, is decisive while also rallying support from people wanting strong leadership. This confidence, tied to the reclaiming the nation narrative, directly justifies his policies as the necessary steps to take back control from the corrupt or incompetent.
And the narrative flips the script on who holds the power between the state and the gangs.
Dramatically. It shifts from depicting gangs as these powerful entities controlling territory to portraying them as terrified, hiding. The analysis highlights that really vivid, dehumanizing quote, "Now they are literally hiding like rats. They are hiding from our police." That imagery hammers home the state's regained dominance. The state is the hunter now.
Leading to this feeling of regained national sovereignty.
Exactly. That quote, "Finally, Salvadorans can think of something other than trying not to be killed. We can aspire to more. Now it is truly ours." really captures that sense of liberation, restored control. The basic freedom from fear, stolen by gangs, has been returned. People can now think about the future. It positions Bukele as the strong leader needed to fight both the gangs and the corrupt elites to win the country back for the people.
And he also emphasizes that these security wins are purely Salvadoran achievements, rejecting foreign input.
Right, this hits both the anti-establishment and nationalist notes. He stresses El Salvador figured this out on its own. We had to create our own methods without letting anyone foreign or domestic tell us what to do. That implicitly jabs at international bodies or countries raising human rights concerns. It reinforces national pride, self-reliance. He states it plainly. We don't take orders from the international community, nor do we bow down before the countries that want to tell us how to solve our problems.
And the analysis connects this national pride, this anti-elitism, to legitimizing his approach.
Yes. By framing his actions as necessary for national security and sovereignty, free from outside meddling, any criticism, foreign or domestic, can be painted as an attack on the nation itself. The analysis suggests this shores up his position, justifies his policies by framing them as essential for independence, unfairly attacked by outsiders who just don't get it. The core idea here is how the reclamation of power story uses nationalism and anti-elitism to cast Bukele as the savior who restored dignity by defeating enemies, thereby justifying his centralized power.
Okay, finally, the analysis pulls all these threads together to discuss how this rhetoric functions in justifying control.
Right, this is the synthesis. The argument is that Bukele skillfully blends these populist rhetorical tactics with authoritarian tendencies. The goal? To shape public perception, solidify his authority. It's presented as protecting the nation, but the analysis suggests it also works to legitimize his government's potentially authoritarian methods in the eyes of many Salvadorans.
The source mentions his use of humor mixed with sternness as part of this.
Yeah, it's that managed persona again. The analysis suggests this blend approachable humor, then resolute seriousness helps reinforce his stated motives, fighting gangs relentlessly. But it might also, perhaps deliberately, obscure the full implications of his actions, the extent of state power being asserted. And a key point the analysis makes is that building his own image is inseparable from tearing down opponents. Marginalizing them is crucial to consolidating power.
Which leads to that really striking analogy the analysis discusses, comparing the gang fight to defeating Nazism in WWII.
Yeah, that comparison is designed to be provocative, impactful. He uses it to suggest his aggressive measures should be seen as legitimate, just like actions against Nazism were. He notes, people applauded the action, both here and abroad, referring to WWII.
And the direct quote is, because they had to erase Nazism. So here in El Salvador, thank God we never had a Nazi problem, but we did have a gang problem.
The analysis interprets this as an attempt to frame his own approach as not just necessary, but maybe even less severe than something historically accepted as requiring extreme measures. By equating gangs with Nazis, he elevates the threat level massively. It implicitly argues his tough measures, however harsh, are justified, maybe even restrained relative to that historical benchmark. It's a way to normalize policies involving mass arrests and suspended rights, portraying them as acceptable, necessary responses.
So it's part of a wider pattern of pushing for repressive measures as the only solution.
Exactly. His rhetoric consistently frames tough, forceful actions as the only way to save the nation, achieve progress. Highlighting the peace from the state of exception, his willingness to take a hit, it all emphasizes commitment to these stringent policies. The analysis suggests this focus on drastic solutions often sidelines concerns about due process or democratic norms, framing harshness as the sole realistic option given the cancer.
And his rejection of pluralism, of opposition, seems very clear.
Absolutely. The analysis points to his insistence that any alternative policy from the opposition would just bring back chaos. That, quote, all of the opposition has been pulverized isn't just bragging about political dominance, it's a rhetorical dismissal of any alternative. The analysis links this directly to the core of authoritarianism, suppressing and refusing to tolerate legitimate opposition.
So the analysis argues that populism becomes the vehicle for consolidating this authoritarian control.
That's the central argument connecting the two here. The populist language, the unified people, the evil enemies, the national pride strengthens that emotional tie between leader and base. And it provides the justification for silencing rivals. Authoritarian populists, this view contends, position themselves as the only true voice of the people, the nation's savior. They tap into public sentiment, especially fear and frustration, to push through anti-democratic policies, framing them as demanded by supporters. Public acceptance then becomes a tool to entrench their power.
And the heavy use of war language reinforces all this.
It's fundamental to the war on gangs framing. Words like combating, defeat, armed to the teeth, war, constantly used to stress the severity, the need for overwhelming force. That, quote, if the gangs thought that they were already facing armed forces who were armed to the teeth, they have no idea of the armed force they will now face, is pure projection of power, intimidation. The analysis suggests this language magnifies the state's response, makes gangs seem powerless, and crucially, helps disguise potentially authoritarian actions as just necessary defense tactics in a war for survival.
So ultimately, the analysis suggests he's channeling public fear very effectively to build and maintain authoritarian control.
That seems to be the core synthesis presented. By tapping into that deep public fear of gangs, he creates an environment where stringent controls are not just tolerated but welcomed by many under the banner of security. And at the same time, his rhetoric offers this powerful narrative of hope, of transformation, positioning him as the leader who finally delivered the safety people craved.
Wow. This has been a really detailed look at how this analysis dissects Bukele's communication strategy. So, pulling back a bit, what are the main implications or discussion points that come out of this study?
Well, the number one finding, as we've gone through, is the connection the analysis draws between those specific features of his populist rhetoric, the ustam, the unified people, the crisis framing, the nationalism, and how that language potentially serves to legitimize policies that lean more authoritarian.
And as we stressed earlier, the context in El Salvador is just absolutely key to understanding why this rhetoric lands so effectively, according to the analysis.
Crucial, the analysis really emphasizes this. The rhetoric works, it resonates because of that brutal history with gangs and the resulting understandable public hunger for decisive action. There's this public appetite, you could say, for security above all else. The analysis touches on ideas like punitive Darwinism society, wanting the state to be ruthless against threats. Exploiting that deep fear is central to explaining the sustained support for his approach, even with the cost to democratic norms.
And his mastery of social media was instrumental.
Absolutely. The analysis notes how those digital platforms let him completely bypass traditional media gatekeepers, gave him that direct, unfiltered line to the public, allowed him to carefully craft his persona, control the narrative, influence perception in ways that were really hard for opponents to counter.
But the analysis consistently flags the potential costs.
It does. While it acknowledges the real security gains, the public relief, the analysis consistently brings up the perspective that these heavy-handed policies often come at a real cost to human rights, to the health of democratic institutions. Democratic backsliding that move away from democratic norms is explicitly mentioned as a serious concern raised by this analysis.
So the core tension that runs through this whole analysis is that really difficult balancing act, prioritizing the war on gangs, achieving security, versus upholding democratic values and institutions.
That's the central dilemma the study illuminates. That tension between perceived effectiveness in a crisis and the potential erosion of liberties, checks and balances, pluralism, it's tough.
This deep dive has really given us a detailed framework for thinking about this complex interplay, rhetoric, power, public reaction in El Salvador.
It definitely highlights how powerful language, narrative, and strategic communication can be in shaping political realities, especially in really challenging situations.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, the analysis we've explored kind of leaves us with a final thought that really captures the transformation El Salvador is experiencing.
Yeah, the concluding statement from the source material really sticks with you. Ultimately, the statement, El Salvador is a different country now, is one that encapsulates the transformation the country has undergone, highlighting Bukele's revolutionary policies on gang control. While some may view these impacts negatively, the electorate's continued support makes fully discrediting his approach a complex and intricate matter.
That last part really hits home, doesn't it? The complexity. It's not a situation that allows for easy judgments from afar. And it leaves us, and you listening, with a fundamental question that goes way beyond El Salvador. It asks us to think about the implications for any democratic society facing severe threats. Given this analysis of how powerful rhetoric can harness public fear and the demand for security, how do you think societies can best navigate that incredibly tricky balance between achieving necessary safety and protecting the very democratic principles that can feel so fragile in times of crisis?
It's a question that really forces reflection, doesn't it? On the stories we believe, the leaders we choose, the values we prioritize when we feel threatened. It demands constant vigilance, critical thinking.
Absolutely. Definitely something for all of us to keep pondering. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We've looked closely at the sources, unpacked the analysis, and hopefully given you some valuable tools for understanding these powerful forces at play.